This story was sent to me by a listener who identifies himself as Andres, an on-call doctor in a public hospital in a medium-sized city. He wrote to me that he is not someone who believes in supernatural things, that his training and work have taught him to seek rational explanations for everything, and that precisely because of this, what he experienced during a night shift 2 years ago disturbed him in a way that he still hasn't fully resolved. If you have an experience you've kept to yourself that you never knew how to tell, write to me. Sometimes the right place for certain stories is not everyday conversation, but a space like this, where no one will judge you. Now, allow me to tell you what happened to Andres on the hospital ward during the 3 o'clock shift with a patient who hadn't spoken for 3 weeks. I have been working in emergency and hospitalization for 12 years. I have seen people die. I have seen individuals in the most extreme moments of their lives, with fear on their faces and their bodies failing, and their consciousness clinging to whatever it can. I have learned to process that in the way doctors do, with a functional distance that is not coldness but professional survival, the ability to compartmentalize what you see in order to remain useful. I share this to make it clear from the beginning that I am not someone who is easily frightened. I am not someone who interprets the creaks of an old building as something supernatural, nor do I see meaning in coincidences. I am, or was, a deeply skeptical person about everything that lacks verifiable explanation. What happened that night on the 4th floor has no verifiable explanation, and I have spent 2 years trying to find it. The hospital where I work has 5 floors for hospitalization and emergency services on the ground floor. The 4th floor is for internal medicine, where cases that require prolonged observation but are not in critical condition are admitted. It is a quiet floor compared to the emergency room or the ICU. The patients are usually elderly people with decompensated chronic conditions who stay there for days or weeks while they stabilize. On that floor, there was a patient who had been admitted for 3 weeks when what I am about to recount happened. His name was Mr. Aurelio. He was 84 years old, and he had been admitted for pneumonia that had evolved complicatedly in a man of his age and with his medical history. Physically, he was responding to treatment. The markers were improving week by week, and everything indicated that in a couple of weeks he could be discharged. The problem was that Mr. Aurelio did not speak, not because he couldn't. His vocal cords were functioning, his airways were clear, his level of consciousness was adequate. He simply did not speak. He looked at those who entered his room with complete and quiet attention, responded to basic instructions, allowed himself to be examined without resistance, but did not utter a single word. Psychiatry had evaluated him, the neurologist had too. There was no identifiable injury, no diagnosable dementia. The provisional conclusion was reactive mutism, likely related to the stress of prolonged hospitalization in an elderly person. His family, a daughter and a son-in-law who came to visit him every afternoon, said that he had always been a man of few words, but that this was different. That since he was admitted, there was something in him that they did not recognize. That sometimes when they arrived for a visit, they found him staring at the corner of the room, the corner that was in front of his bed, with a fixation that made them uncomfortable. I had attended to Mr. Aurelio during several shifts. He was an easy patient in a practical sense. He didn't cause problems, and he didn't need much active attention beyond routine monitoring. But there was something about him that also made me uncomfortable, although I had never analyzed it too much until that night. It was the way he looked at that corner. The Wednesday shift started normally. I received the afternoon report, reviewed the patients who needed priority attention, and made rounds on the floors. Mr. Aurelio was stable. He ate what was served to him, which was already an improvement from previous weeks. When I entered his room around 10 o'clock at night for the night check, he looked at me with his calm and still attention. The corner in front of his bed was empty, as always, but he wasn't looking at it that night. He was looking at me. I noted his vital signs, asked him if he was in pain, received silence as the usual response, and left. At 1 in the morning, I received a call from the 4th floor. The on-duty nurse named Pilar, who had been at that hospital longer than I had, called me with a voice that was not of medical urgency but of something else that I couldn't classify immediately. "Dr. Andres, can you come to room 42? Room 42 was Don Aurelio's room. "What's wrong?" I asked. "Has he gotten worse?" "No," Pilar said. "He is talking." It took me a second to process that. "He is talking?" "Yes. A brief pause. Please come. I went up to the fourth floor. The hallway was in that specific calm of hospitals in the early morning. The lighting dimmed. The distant sound of some monitor. The smell of disinfectant that one stops noticing after years. But that night I perceived with a strange clarity. Pilar was waiting for me outside room 42. She was a woman in her 50s, with that accumulated experience of someone who has seen practically everything in a hospital and is no longer easily unsettled. But that night she had an expression I had never seen before. "How long has he been talking?" I asked quietly. "For about 20 minutes, Pilar said, also quietly. It caught my attention because I heard the voice from the hallway and thought someone had come in to visit him, that it was a voice I didn't recognize. I went in, and he was alone. "What is he saying?" Pilar looked at me. "That's what I want you to hear," she said. I gently pushed the door and entered. The room was dimly lit, with only the soft light from the bedside lamp on. Don Aurelio was sitting up in bed, his eyes open, staring directly at the corner across the room, that corner his family had mentioned. And he was speaking. It was a low, continuous voice, with the rhythm of someone having a conversation. Not a monologue. A conversation, with pauses between phrases, as if he were listening to responses that I couldn't hear. The voice was calm, without agitation, without signs of distress. But there was something in it that made the hairs on my arms stand on end before my brain processed why. It was not Don Aurelio's voice. Oh, it wasn't exactly his voice. It was deeper. It had a different cadence, something older in tone, as if the words were coming from a place deeper than the throat. I attributed it in that first moment to the illness, to the effects of weeks of previous intubation, to any medical explanation that could accommodate what I was hearing. I approached. I stood next to his bed. Don Aurelio did not look at me. His eyes remained fixed on the corner. I listened to what he was saying. Most of it was difficult to understand, words in a low voice overlapping each other. But I caught fragments, and what I caught stuck with me with a precision that still feels strange, because at that moment I was not in a position to take notes, but the words settled in my memory with a clarity that did not correspond to the circumstances. He said, "I know it's time." And then, after a pause, "Not yet." And then, "There is someone who shouldn't hear this." At that moment, his eyes moved from the corner to me. He looked directly at me, with that still and complete attention of his. And for the first time in 3 weeks of guard duty, Don Aurelio spoke to me. "Doctor," he said with that voice that was not quite his voice, "do you believe in what cannot be seen?" It took me a second to respond. "I am a doctor. I am trained to maintain composure in stressful situations." "Don Aurelio," I said with my voice as calm as I could, "I'm glad you are speaking. How do you feel? You?" He did not answer my question. He kept looking at me. "There are things that stay in places," he said, "like the smell of tobacco in a room where someone smoked for years. You can't see it, but it's there. Do you understand?" "I understand what you're telling me," I said. "No," he said. And in that denial there was something that was not correction, but something more like the calm certainty of someone who knows exactly what they are talking about. "You understand the words, not what is behind the words." He leaned back against the pillow again. His eyes returned to the corner, and the conversation that I could not hear continued. I left the room. Pilar was in the hallway. "Had anything like this ever happened before?" I asked her. She took a moment. "In that room," she said, "about 7 years ago a patient died who had been admitted for several weeks. He was also an older man. He also spent the last week talking to something that no one else could see or hear." She paused. "Back then, I thought it was the medication, or the terminal state, or just what happens to people when they are very close to the end. And now?" I said. Pilar looked at me with that expression of hers that was not exactly fear, but something more reflective. "Now I think that maybe there are things that happen in certain places and that certain people can perceive and others cannot," she said, "and that Don Aurelio is one of those who can." I returned to the room 3 more times that night. On each occasion, Don Aurelio was in the same position, with his eyes in the corner, speaking in a low voice. On the second visit, his vital signs were perfectly normal. On the third, around 4 in the morning, he fell silent, closed his eyes, and fell asleep with the placidity of someone who has finished a long and satisfying conversation. I stood at the door of his room for a moment, looking at that empty corner to which he had dedicated so many hours of attention, and tried to feel something, anything, any variation in temperature or air pressure, or any measurable parameter that would give me a rational anchor to what I had witnessed. I felt nothing. The corner was just a corner. White walls, linoleum floor, the leg of a visitor's chair. With nothing visible, no anomalies detected, nothing that my medical training or common sense could point to as the source of what had happened that night. I closed the door and went to write the shift notes. The next morning, when day shift arrived, I informed the attending physician about Mr. Aurelio that the patient had spoken during the night. She noted it with clinical interest, went to see him, and called me a little while later with something in her voice that was not exactly surprise, but something more akin to controlled perplexity. Mr. Aurelio had spoken to her. Not much, not extensively, but he had answered her questions briefly and clearly. He had told her that he felt well. He had asked her when he could go home. The physician interpreted it as a spontaneous resolution of the mutism, which was not unusual in these types of cases. She called psychiatry for a re-evaluation. She called the family to inform them of the change. Everyone was happy. I should have been too. The patient was improving. It was the expected outcome. But that afternoon, before going home to sleep after my shift, I went up to the 4th floor once more. The door to room 42 was open. Don Aurelio was sitting on the bed, looking out the window, with the afternoon light coming in at an angle. His daughter had come to visit and was sitting beside him, holding his hand, with that expression of relief of someone who has regained something they feared they had lost. I peeked into the doorway. Don Aurelio saw me, and he said something I didn't expect. "Doctor." His voice was now more recognizable, more his own, with that raspy tone of men his age who have smoked for a long time. "Thank you for staying last night." "It's my job," I said. He shook his head very slowly. "Not for that," he said. "For not leaving when you should have." A pause. "There are things that are better if someone is present. Someone who is not afraid." His daughter was looking at us, not entirely understanding the exchange. I didn't fully understand it either, but I nodded. And Don Aurelio looked out the window again. She was discharged 2 weeks later. She walked out, with her daughter on one side and her son-in-law on the other, with that quiet dignity of the elderly who have decided that what time they have left will be lived on their own terms. As she passed by the nursing station, she saw me and stopped for a moment. "Take care," she told me simply, and she left. Pilar and I looked at each other when she disappeared down the hallway toward the elevators. "Did she ever ask you who she was talking to?" Pilar asked me. "Not directly," I said. "I did," she said. "The morning after that night, I asked her, just like that, who she had been talking to." She paused. She looked at me for a moment and said, "Someone who needed to be heard, and who had been waiting a long time for someone to do it." I processed that in silence. "And what do you think?" I asked her. Pilar picked up some papers from the control desk and organized them with that efficiency of hers, as someone who always has something to do. "I think," he said, "that there are people who can do things that others cannot, that there are places where those things are easier, and that sometimes what seems like an illness is something completely different." He looked at me, and I think that room is now quieter than before Don Aurelio arrived, and that whatever it means seems good to me. 2 years have passed since that night. I have continued working in the same hospital, on the same 4th floor, and I have entered room 42 hundreds of times since then. It is a room like the others, with its white walls and linoleum floor and its window overlooking the parking lot. The corner in front of the bed is just a corner, but there is something that changed in me that night and has not returned to its previous state, and it is the way I listen to patients who speak of things I cannot see. It's not that I now blindly believe in the supernatural. I am still a doctor. I still look for medical explanations first. I still apply the protocol. But there is something in my attitude that opened a millimeter that night and has not completely closed. A willingness to consider that perhaps not everything that happens in hospital rooms at dawn has an explanation that fits in a medical manual. And sometimes, when I do the night round and pass by 42 with the door ajar and the room in shadow, I pause for a moment in the hallway, listening, The silence inside is different from that of the other rooms. I don't know if that means anything, but I no longer ignore it. And that's all Andres told me. This is the testimony of Andres. He wrote to me at the end that Don Aurelio passed away a few months after being discharged at home, surrounded by his family, calmly according to what his daughter told him in a message she sent to inform him. I thought it was important to include that. There is something in this story that has to do with listening, with what happens when someone finally pays attention to what others cannot or do not want to see. If you work in a hospital or anywhere you are close to people in critical moments and have experienced something you didn't know how to explain, I would like to know. Leave it in the comments. And if you are not yet subscribed to the channel, consider doing so. There are more stories like this waiting. Sleep well tonight. We'll talk soon. Someone who prefers to remain anonymous sent me this experience a few days ago. They work as a paramedic on night shifts, and what they witnessed during an emergency call at an abandoned house has kept them awake since then. If you work in emergency services and have seen something you can't explain, I would really like you to share it in the comments. Now this is the story of a night that forever changed the way this paramedic views their job. I can't give my real name for reasons that will become clear. I have been working as a paramedic in a medium-sized city in Colombia for 8 years. I have seen all kinds of emergencies, car accidents, heart attacks, stab wounds, overdoses. I thought nothing could surprise me anymore. I was completely wrong. What I am about to tell happened 3 months ago during a Friday night shift. It was 2:30 in the morning when we received the call. A woman's voice, hysterical, screaming that her son was dying, that he needed help immediately. She gave us an address on the outskirts of the city, in a neighborhood I vaguely knew as an old residential area. Large houses of well-off families that had moved in decades ago. My partner that night was Javier, a guy with 20 years of experience who had literally seen it all. We got into the ambulance and headed to the address while the dispatcher tried to get more information from the call. But the line had cut off after giving the address, and when they tried to call the number back, no one answered. Probably a child with a high fever, Javier commented as he drove through the empty streets. First-time parents always panic. We arrive, give him something to bring down the temperature, and that's it. We arrived at the address in 15 minutes. The house was at the end of a dead-end street, surrounded by tall trees that blocked the light from the street lamps. It was an old 2-story building, Spanish colonial style, with white walls stained by moisture and a completely neglected garden. All the windows were dark. "Are you sure this is the place?" I asked as we got out of the ambulance with our equipment. Javier checked the address on his phone. "It's here, number 247. We approached the front door. I rang the doorbell, but it didn't work. I knocked hard on the door. "Emergency medical services. Please open up." There was no response. I tried turning the doorknob, and to my surprise, it was open. The door creaked open slowly with a prolonged squeak that made my skin crawl. "I don't like this," I murmured. "Me neither," Javier agreed, "but we have an emergency call for a sick child. We can't just leave." We entered with our flashlights on. The interior smelled of dampness, mold, and something sweeter that I couldn't identify. The beam of my flashlight revealed a spacious foyer with furniture covered in dusty white sheets. The walls had damp marks, and the wallpaper was peeling off in long strips. "Hello?" I called. "We are paramedics. Is anyone here?" A sound came from the second floor. Footsteps. Slow, dragging, and then a woman's voice, weak and trembling. "Upstairs, please, my son." Javier and I exchanged glances. Something about this felt deeply wrong, but we had a duty to investigate. We carefully climbed the stairs, testing each step before putting our full weight down. The wood creaked ominously. On the second floor there was a long hallway with several doors. One of them, at the end of the hallway, was ajar. A pale light emanated from within, flickering as if it were from candles. We approached cautiously. I pushed the door, and what I saw made me stop dead in my tracks. The room was illuminated with dozens of black candles arranged in a circle. In the center of the circle, on the wooden floor, lay a child of perhaps 8 years. He was completely still, with his eyes closed, dressed in white clothing that looked old-fashioned. His skin was pale, almost gray. Next to the child, kneeling, was a middle-aged woman with long black hair loose over her shoulders. She wore a dark dress and had her hands extended over the child in what seemed to be some kind of ritual. "Ma'am, we are paramedics," I said, quickly approaching. "Please step aside. We need to examine the child." The woman did not move. She didn't even look up. She continued murmuring something softly, words I couldn't understand. Javier moved to the other side of the circle. "Ma'am, we need you to step aside now. Your son needs medical attention." When the woman finally lifted her head to look at us, I felt a chill run down my spine. His eyes were completely black with no visible white, and when he spoke, his voice sounded strange, as if several people were speaking at the same time. "They can't stop it. It's already done. The pact is sealed." "What pact?" I asked, but Javier was already crossing the circle of candles to reach the boy. The moment Javier stepped inside the circle, all the candles went out simultaneously. Darkness fell over the room like a heavy blanket. My flashlight flickered and went out. Javier's did too. "What the hell?" I heard Javier curse in the darkness. I took out my phone to use its light, but the screen was completely black even though it had been fully charged moments before. In that absolute darkness, I heard the woman laugh. It wasn't normal laughter. It was high-pitched, hysterical, and definitely not coming from a single throat. Then the candles reignited on their own, all at once with flames burning twice as high as before, casting dancing shadows on the walls. The woman was no longer kneeling. She was standing, and there was something deeply wrong with the way her body moved, as if her joints weren't functioning properly. She turned towards us, and I saw that her skin had taken on a sickly grayish hue. Black smoke was coming from her open mouth. "He promised me power," she said with that multiple voice. "Power over life and death. All I asked for was the soul of my son. A fair exchange." "Ma'am, you're delirious." I tried to use my calmest tone, even though my heart was racing wildly. "He needs psychiatric help. We're going to take the child and then we'll talk about getting him help too." Javier was already with the child, checking his vital signs. "He has no pulse," he said urgently. "And he's cold, very cold. We need to start CPR now." But when Javier tried to move the child out of the circle, something stopped him. It was as if there was an invisible barrier. The child's body simply wouldn't move beyond the edge of the circle of candles, as if it were bound by invisible strings. "He's trapped," the woman murmured, smiling with a grotesque expression. "His soul is no longer in his body. It's in the hands of my master, and soon I too will be free from this mortal flesh, free to serve in the realm of shadows." At that moment, the child's body convulsed. His eyes snapped open, but they were not the eyes of a child. They were black like the woman's, empty of everything except darkness. His mouth opened, and from it came a voice that was not childish but deep and resonant. "More souls," said the boy who was no longer a boy. "We bring more souls. The witnesses are welcome. Join the service." Javier stepped back, his professional training finally overcome by primal terror. "We need to get out of here, now." But when we turned toward the door, it slammed shut. I tried to open it, but it was sealed, as if it had fused with the frame. The windows too, although there was nothing visible blocking them. The room temperature had dropped drastically. I could see my breath forming clouds in the air. The candles burned brighter, but their light gave no warmth, only a ghostly illumination that made everything look surreal. The woman began to walk in circles around the child, singing in a language I had never heard. Her voice blended with the voice coming from the child's body, creating a discordant harmony that hurt my ears. On the walls, the shadows began to move in ways that did not correspond with the candlelight. They stretched, twisted, taking shapes that vaguely resembled humans, but were completely wrong. And in those shadows, I could swear I saw faces, dozens of them, all silently screaming. "This is a demonic possession," Javier whispered, his voice trembling. "Either we're having a collective hallucination from carbon monoxide or something worse." "I am a paramedic, not a priest," I replied, trying to maintain some semblance of rationality. "But whatever this is, we need to get out." I tried to break the window with a chair, but the glass wouldn't shatter. It was like hitting solid steel. Javier tried to break down the door, but it was equally futile. The woman's chant grew louder, more frantic. The child's body began to slowly levitate off the ground, rising to hover 1/2 meter in the air, arms outstretched, as if crucified in midair. And then, something began to materialize in the room. At first, it was just a distortion in the air, like heat rising from asphalt. But gradually, it solidified into a shape that my mind struggled to process. It was vaguely humanoid, at least 2.5 meters tall, but its skin was like cracked black coal with red light shining from the fissures. He had twisted horns protruding from his head, and his eyes burned with sickly yellow fire. "The master has arrived," the woman said, kneeling. "I have fulfilled my part of the pact. My son belongs to you. Now give me what you promised." The creature spoke, and its voice resonated not only in the room but inside my head, vibrating in my bones. "The child is mine. But you still have use in this plane. I cannot free you yet." The woman let out a scream of frustration and rage. You promised you would take me with you, that you would make me immortal in your service." "And I will," the creature replied, "but not yet. First, you must bring me more souls. These two will do." It pointed at Javier and me. It was at that moment that Javier did something unexpected. He pulled a small crucifix from his pocket, something I didn't know he had, and held it in front of him with a trembling hand. "In the name of Christ, I command you to leave," he said, his voice gaining strength. "You have no power over us." The creature laughed, a sound like stones being crushed. "A symbol? Is that all? Symbols only have the power you give them. And your faith?" It leaned toward Javier, sniffing. "Your faith is weak, doctor, filled with doubts. You don't scare me." But as the creature spoke, I noticed something. When Javier had crossed the circle of candles, he had broken the pattern. One of the candles had tipped over, extinguishing itself. The circle was no longer complete. "Javier," I whispered, "the circle, it's broken. The ritual is not complete." Javier's eyes widened with understanding. Without thinking twice, he kicked over another candle, then another. The circle broke at multiple points. The creature roared with fury. "No, the ceiling!" The floating body of the child fell to the ground with a dull thud. The woman screamed, lunging towards us with her hands outstretched like claws. But when she reached the edge of where the circle had been, she stopped abruptly, as if she had hit an invisible wall. The circle contained her too, I realized. She couldn't leave while the ritual was not complete. The creature was fading, its solid form becoming translucent. "This is not over," it promised in a fading voice. "I have been summoned. Now I know where this place is. I will return, and when I do, all the souls here will be mine." With a final flash of red light, the creature completely disappeared. The temperature in the room began to normalize. The door, which had been sealed, swung open abruptly. The woman fell to the floor, sobbing. Her eyes had returned to normal, no longer black but common brown. She looked confused, disoriented. What happened?" she murmured. "Where is my son? Where is Miguel?" Javier cautiously approached the child. He checked his pulse, his breathing. "He's alive," he said with evident surprise. "Weak, but alive. He has a pulse and is breathing." We loaded the child onto a stretcher and helped the woman walk. She was in shock, seeming to remember nothing of the ritual or the creature. She kept asking what had happened, why she was in that abandoned house, how she had gotten there. When we left the house, the cool night air had never felt so welcome. We loaded both the woman and the child into the ambulance. During the ride to the hospital, the child briefly regained consciousness. He looked at me with clear, normal, childlike eyes. "I was in a dark place," he whispered. "There was something there that wanted to stay with me. But you took me out. Thank you." At the hospital, both the child and the woman were admitted for observation. The doctors found nothing physically wrong with them except dehydration and low blood sugar levels. The psychiatric evaluation determined that the woman had experienced some type of psychotic episode, possibly drug-induced, although the blood tests came back clean. The official story was that a woman with mental health issues had taken her child to an abandoned house during a psychotic episode, and that we had found and rescued them. Simple, neat, rational, but Javier and I knew the truth. We had seen something that had no rational explanation, something ancient and malevolent that existed on the fringes of reality, waiting to be invoked by those desperate or crazy enough to try. We reported the incident as we experienced it to the on-duty coordinator that night, but they looked at us as if we were delirious. They conducted toxicology tests to ensure we had not been under the influence of substances. The tests came back clean. Work stress was the official diagnosis. Shared hallucination induced by exhaustion and the unsettling atmosphere of the abandoned house. They gave us a week of mandatory rest and recommended sessions with the department's psychologist. But I know what I saw. Javier does too. We have talked about it privately, away from official ears. We both saw the same thing. We both felt the same thing. And we both know that what we encountered that night was real. I have researched the house since then. It turns out it has a dark history. It was owned by a wealthy family in the 60s. The patriarch, a man named Augusto Restrepo, was obsessed with the occult. He performed rituals in that house, invoked entities, sought power over death. In 1968, the entire family died under mysterious circumstances. The bodies were found in that same room on the second floor, arranged in a circle with black candles around. The investigation concluded that it was a murder-suicide, but it was never determined what motivated Augusto to kill his entire family, and then himself. The house has been abandoned since then. Several subsequent owners tried to live there, but all reported strange phenomena and quickly moved out. Eventually, it was completely abandoned. I don't know how that woman and her son ended up there that night. When she regained lucidity, she didn't remember going to that house. Her last clear memory was being in her apartment, reading a story to her son before bed. Then, a void. And after that, waking up in the ambulance with us. The child doesn't remember much either. Just fragments of dark dreams, whispering voices, and a feeling of intense cold. Javier carries the crucifix with him all the time now. He wasn't particularly religious before, but something about that experience changed his perspective. He goes to Mass every Sunday, something he had never done before. I have started to research more about the occult, not because I want to practice it, but because I want to understand. I want to know what we saw, what kind of entity it was, and above all, I want to know if what it said is true, that it would return. Because that is the part that keeps me awake at night. The creature said it had been summoned, that it now knew where that place was, and that it would come back. When? And for what purpose? I have driven down that street several times since then, always during the day, never alone. The house is still there, abandoned, dark. Sometimes I swear I see movement in the windows of the second floor, shadows that shouldn't be there in an empty house. The city has condemned the property now. There are plans to finally demolish it, after decades of abandonment. Part of me hopes that this will help, that destroying the physical structure will also destroy any portal or connection that exists there. But another part of me, the part that saw what I saw, knows it won't be that simple. What Augusto Restrepo invoked in the 60s, what that woman touched again 3 months ago, is not tied to bricks and wood. It is something more fundamental, more ancient. It exists in the spaces between light and darkness, waiting to be called by those who seek power, knowledge, or escape from their mortality. And there will always be desperate people, arrogant people, or simply curious people who cross the lines that should not be crossed. I continue to work as a paramedic. It's the only thing I know how to do, the only thing I'm good at. But now I carry protection with me, blessed salt in small packets, holy water in a bottle, and yes, my own crucifix. Maybe they are of no use. Maybe Javier's faith was what really made the difference that night. But they make me feel slightly safer on night calls. Because now I know that not all emergencies we respond to are medical. Some are spiritual. Some are battles in a war that most people don't know is being fought, between forces that existed long before us and will continue to exist long after. And sometimes, in the normal course of our work, we stumble upon those battles, and we have to decide in that moment whether to flee or to face. That night, Javier and I faced, and we survived. But I don't know if we will be so lucky next time, because I feel, on some deep level, that there will be a next time. That creature, that demon, or whatever it was, saw us. It knows us, and the last words it said will resonate in my mind for the rest of my life. I will return, and when I do, all the souls here will be mine. I don't know when that moment will be, but I will be ready, or at least as ready as a simple paramedic can be against forces that defy all logic and reason. That's all this paramedic wanted to share. He told me that writing this was almost cathartic, a way to process the trauma of that night. The house was demolished last month, but he still has nightmares about what he saw. If you work in emergency services and have encountered something inexplicable, I would love to hear your story in the comments. Sometimes those who respond to calls for help find more than they expected. Sleep well tonight. This story was sent to me by a follower named Tomas, who worked as a forest ranger in the forests of southern Chile. What he found during a night patrol made him question everything he believed about the rural legends of his region. If you have spent time in remote forests and felt like something was watching you from the darkness among the trees, share it in the comments. Now let me tell you what Tomas discovered in the depths of the forest, where ancient stories are still alive. My name is Tomas, and for 7 years I worked as a forest ranger in Alerce Costero National Park in the Los Rios region, Chile. It was a solitary but rewarding job. I spent entire days walking along ancient trails, monitoring the flora and fauna, making sure that visitors followed the park regulations. I loved solitude, the silence interrupted only by the singing of the birds and the whisper of the wind among the ancient larches. But that was before the night of June 21st, before I found the clearing, before I knew that some legends exist for a reason. It all started when I received reports from several hikers about strange lights in the northern sector of the park, near the Black River Valley. The descriptions were consistent, bluish lights moving among the trees, appearing and disappearing, as if someone were carrying flashlights but not following any established path. My first thought was that they were poachers. The park had occasional problems with people illegally entering to hunt huemules or produce protected species. I decided to do a night patrol to investigate. I set out at sunset on the winter solstice, the shortest day of the year in the southern hemisphere. I was carrying my backpack with supplies, flashlight, radio, and my standard rifle. The plan was to walk to the Black River Valley, about 3 hours of hiking, set up an observation camp, and wait to see if the lights appeared. The forest was different at dusk. The larches, some over 3,000 years old, cast long, twisted shadows. The fog began to form between the trunks, sliding across the forest floor like a living organism. The silence was deep, broken only by the occasional call of an owl or the crackling of branches under my boots. I arrived at the valley around 9 o'clock at night. The full moon shone through the scattered clouds, providing enough light to navigate without my flashlight. I set up my camp at a high point with a good view of the lower valley. From there, I could observe without being seen. I waited. An hour, 2 hours. The temperature steadily dropped, my breath forming clouds in the cold air. I began to think that the hikers had seen reflections of the moon, or perhaps fireflies, although those were rare in this region during winter. Then, around midnight, I saw them. Bluish lights, exactly as they had described. They suddenly appeared among the trees in the lower valley, moving in patterns that followed no logic. They were not constant like lanterns. They flickered, split into multiple smaller lights, gathered again, and they moved fast, too fast to be people walking. I took out my binoculars to see them better. Through the lenses, the lights seemed to have an almost liquid quality, flowing instead of moving solidly. And around them, I could distinguish shapes. Small, humanoid, but definitely not human. My rational mind sought explanations. Methane gas phenomena rising from the marshy ground, bioluminescent fungi, some kind of atmospheric reflection. But even as I thought these things, I knew that none explained what I was seeing. The lights moved to a specific area of the valley and stopped. They formed a circle, and then from my elevated position I heard something that made my skin crawl. Music. It was not modern music or anything that could come from an electronic device. It was music from ancient instruments, flutes and drums, played in rhythms that sounded both foreign and familiar at the same time. I decided to get closer to investigate. I knew it was risky, but it was my job to protect the park, and I needed to know what was happening. I descended silently down the valley slope, using the cover of the trees to hide my approach. As I got closer, the music became clearer, more complex, and now I could hear voices as well, singing in a language I didn't recognize, words that sounded like Mapudungun, the Mapuche language, but distorted, older. I reached the edge of a clearing that I didn't remember seeing on any park map. In the center of the clearing was a large stone, almost the size of a small car, with symbols carved into its surface that glowed faintly with the same blue light. And around the stone, dancing in a circle, were creatures. They were not human. They were small, maybe a meter tall, with thin bodies and limbs that seemed too long for their torsos. Their skin was dark, almost black, but it shone with a greenish hue under the moonlight. They had faces that were vaguely humanoid, but with large round eyes that reflected light like those of a nocturnal animal. They wore clothing made of what seemed to be tree bark and moss, decorated with small bones and feathers. Some carried instruments, flutes made of bamboo, drums with stretched skins over wooden frames. Others simply danced, their movements fluid and hypnotic. My mind struggled to process what I was seeing. These creatures resembled the descriptions I had heard in local stories. The Mapuche elders from the villages near the park sometimes spoke of them. The unexplained, forest spirits that dwelled deep in the wild, rarely showing themselves to humans. I had always assumed they were just legends, stories to scare children, or explain natural phenomena that ancient people did not understand. But here they were, as real as the trees around me. I stayed hidden behind a thick, large trunk observing. A part of me wanted to flee immediately. Another part, the curious part that had led me to become a forest ranger in the first place, needed to understand. The ritual, because it was clearly some kind of ritual, continued for what seemed like hours. The creatures sang and danced, and the stone in the center shone more and more brightly. Then, something began to materialize above the stone. It was a figure larger than the others, perhaps 2 meters tall, but clearly of the same species. It wore an elaborate headdress made of branches, animal bones, and what appeared to be bird skulls. Its skin was paler than the others, almost gray, and marked with tattoos or paintings that formed spiral patterns. When this figure spoke, its voice resonated in the clearing as if it came from all directions. It spoke in that ancient language, but somehow I could understand fragments. He spoke of balance, of territories, of an ancient pact that needed to be renewed. The smallest creatures knelt. The large being extended its hands, and from the earth around the stone, things began to emerge. Plants I did not recognize, sprouting and growing at impossible speed. Mushrooms that shone with their own light. And among the plants, animals appeared. Foxes, poodoos, birds, all approaching the circle without fear. I then understood that I was witnessing something fundamental, something that existed long before humans set foot in these forests. This was a ritual of nature itself, a renewal of cycles that had continued for millennia. I should have stayed hidden. I should have observed in silence and then withdrawn without being detected. But at that moment, I stepped on a dry branch. The crack echoed in the clearing like a gunshot. All the creatures froze. Their heads turned in unison towards my position. Dozens of pairs of bright eyes looked directly at me, even though I was hidden in the darkness among the trees. The tall being raised a hand, and the ritual stopped. It spoke a word, and the smaller creatures began to move towards me. They did not run, but glided through the shadows with an unnatural grace that made them difficult to follow with the eye. I stepped back, stumbling in my haste. I turned to run, but they were everywhere, surrounding me, cutting off any escape route. Their eyes glowed in the darkness, watching me without blinking. One of them came closer than the others. She reached out a hand towards me, and I saw that her fingers were long and ended in nails that looked like claws. I expected violence. I expected to be attacked. But instead, the creature simply touched me, a light brush on my arm. And in that moment, visions flooded my mind. I saw the forest as it truly was, not just the trees and animals I could see with my eyes, but the invisible layers beneath. I saw energies flowing through the earth, connecting every plant, every creature. I saw forest spirits, thousands of them, some ancient beyond comprehension, dwelling in trees, rocks, rivers. I saw the history of the forest, going back centuries, millennia. I saw when the first humans arrived, the Mapuche, living in harmony with these spirits. I saw the pacts they made, promises of mutual respect and coexistence. I saw when those pacts began to break, when modern people arrived with their saws and their roads, ignoring the ancient alliances. And I saw the present, where these spirits struggled to maintain balance in a world that increasingly ignored them. I saw that the national park, although legally protected, was still vulnerable, that there were forces working to exploit it, to log it, to turn it into something different from what it had been for thousands of years. The vision ended as abruptly as it had begun. I found myself kneeling on the forest floor, gasping. The creature had withdrawn its hand, and now they all watched me in silence. The tall being approached. Its presence was overwhelming, not threatening but simply vast, like standing in front of a 3,000-year-old lodge and feeling the weight of all that time. He spoke, and this time I understood every word with perfect clarity, although he continued using that ancient language. "You are a guardian of this place," he said. It was not a question. "But you do not truly understand what you guard. This forest is alive in ways that your people have forgotten. We are part of it, just as the roots are part of the tree." "What are you?" I managed to ask. my voice barely a whisper. "We are the unsettling, the guardian spirits. We have inhabited these forests since before your kind learned to walk upright. We maintain the balance. We protect the sacred. And tonight, on the darkest solstice, we renew our pact with the earth. Why are you showing me this? Because changes are coming, forces that seek to destroy this place, and we will need allies among humans. You have been chosen to see, to know, to remember. Chosen by whom? By the forest itself. You carry its mark. You have always carried it. That is why you feel at home here. That is why you chose to protect it." The being extended its hand, and something appeared in its palm, a small stone, the size of a walnut, that shone with the same blue light as the central stone. "Take this. It is a fragment of the heart of the forest. As long as you have it, you will be able to feel when the forest is in danger, and when that moment comes, you must decide how far you are willing to go to protect it." I took the stone. It was warm to the touch, and when my fingers closed around it, I felt a pulse, like a heartbeat. "What if I fail?" I asked. "Then the forest will die, and we with it, and this world will be a little darker, a little quieter, a little more dead." He paused. "But we do not believe you will fail. The forest does not make mistakes in choosing its guardians." The creatures began to withdraw, fading into the shadows. The tall being was the last to leave, its form gradually dissolving until only its bright eyes remained, and then, nothing. I was left alone in the clearing. The central stone had stopped shining, becoming just an ordinary rock. The music had ceased. There was no evidence of the ritual except for the circle of plants that had sprouted, now quickly wilting in the cold winter air. I walked back to my camp in a daze. I spent the rest of the night awake, staring at the small glowing stone in my hand, wondering if it had all been real or if I had some kind of hallucination induced by the cold and fatigue. But when dawn broke and I descended into the valley again, I found the clearing exactly where I remembered it, and the stone in my pocket was still softly pulsing, warm and alive. I returned to the ranger station and wrote my report. I said that I had investigated the reported lights and that they were probably natural bioluminescence phenomena, nothing to worry about. I did not mention the unsettling, or the ritual, or the stone that I now carried with me at all times. Who would have believed me? Even I doubted my sanity at moments of clarity. But then, 3 weeks later, the stone suddenly heated up during my daily patrol. It was not the gentle heat I always felt, but an urgent heat, almost burning my skin through the pocket of my shirt. The forest was in danger. I followed the sensation, letting the stone guide me. It led me to the northern border of the park, where I found a group of men with surveying equipment, marking trees, taking measurements. "This is protected property," I told them, showing my identification. "What are you doing here?" The leader of the group, a man in a suit unsuitable for the forest, showed me documents. A logging company had obtained permits, supposedly legal, for sustainable forest management in a section of the park that they claimed had been declassified. I knew that was false. That sector was part of the park's protected core. These permits were fraudulent, likely obtained through bribery or corruption at higher levels of government. I documented everything. I took photographs, copied the permit numbers, recorded conversations, and then, using contacts I had made over the years with environmental organizations, I leaked the information to the press. What followed was a scandal. It turned out that several government officials had conspired with the logging company to open sections of the park to exploitation. Public pressure forced investigations. The permits were revoked. The corrupt officials were fired and faced criminal charges. The forest was safe. For now. But the stone showed me that this was just the beginning. Over the following months it alerted me to other threats. Poachers organizing massive expeditions, mining companies seeking to exploit mineral deposits near the park, development projects that would have fragmented the ecosystem. Each time, I acted, not always in conventional or completely legal ways. Sometimes I sabotaged equipment. Sometimes I filtered confidential information. Sometimes I was simply in the right place at the right time to document illegal activities. I became something more than a forest ranger. I became a true guardian, as the unsettling had called me. And sometimes, on full moon nights, especially during the solstices, I see the bluish lights again. I do not approach any closer. I have learned that some mysteries are best observed from a distance, with respect and reverence. But I know they are there. I know that the unsettling continue their rituals, maintaining balance, protecting the heart of the forest. and I know that as long as I do my part, they will do theirs. The stone never stops pulsing. It is a constant reminder that I am part of something larger than myself, something ancient and vital. Some days it is a burden, other days it is an honor, but always, it is my responsibility. 2 months ago, I received a job offer in the city, an administrative position with better pay, less risk, more stability. My friends and family urged me to accept it. You've done enough, they told me. It's time to think about your future. But when I held the stone in my hand, feeling its constant pulse, I knew I couldn't leave. The forest had chosen me. The Anchimalen had entrusted me with its protection, and as long as the stone kept beating, as long as the forest kept needing me, my place was here. I rejected the offer. I continue working as a forest ranger in Alerce Costero National Park, and every night, before I sleep, I hold the stone and listen. I listen to the heartbeat of the forest, that ancient pulse that has continued for millennia, and that, if I have anything to say about it, will continue for millennia more. Because some places are sacred, some pacts are eternal, and some guardians cannot simply walk away, no matter how tempting normalcy may be. The forest chose me, and I chose the forest. And that choice, once made, cannot be undone. Thus ends the story that Thomas shared. He told me that he still works in the park, he still carries the stone, he still responds when the forest calls him. If you have ever felt a deep connection with a natural place, as if that place chose you as much as you chose it, let me know in the comments. Sometimes places have guardians, and sometimes those guardians are us. Rest in peace tonight. What I am about to tell you now was sent to me by a listener named Isabel. She wrote to me that she experienced this when she was 23 years old, that almost 8 years have passed since then, and that there are still nights when she wakes up with the smell in her nose. Just the smell, she told me, and that is enough for her not to be able to fall back asleep. If you also have something that haunts you like this, something that doesn't completely fade away with time, write to me. Sometimes it helps to have someone else listen. Isabel's story took place in a mountain village where she spent a summer working as a camp counselor, and it has to do with a forest that the locals knew very well, and with a very specific rule that everyone followed without questioning it: never enter the forest after dark. The job of camp monitor was not what I had planned for that summer, but when the scholarship I was hoping for didn't come through and my bank account started to speak louder than my plans, I accepted the offer without thinking too much. 3 months in a summer camp for children aged 8 to 12, in a mountain village called Fuente Oscura, with accommodation included, and a salary that wasn't generous, but was enough. I left in June with my backpack and the practical disposition of someone who has learned to adapt to what is available. Fuente Oscura was exactly the kind of village that the name suggested. Small, nestled between 2 wooded slopes, with a narrow river running through the center and a square with its church and 4 stone benches. Most of its permanent inhabitants were elderly people. The young people had left for the cities years ago, as happens in so many villages, and what remained was that specific mix of stillness and memory that places have when they have seen several generations depart. The camp was on the outskirts, in a clearing between the village and the forest. Wooden cabins, a large dining room, an activity area, a small pool. The kind of functional facility that has no aesthetic pretensions but perfectly fulfills its purpose. There were 6 monitors in total and a director named Graciela, a woman in her 40s with that quiet efficiency of someone who has organized these things many times and already has a protocol for everything. The first meeting with Graciela, before the children arrived, included a review of the camp's operating rules, schedules, safety protocols, activity organization, emergency procedures, all reasonable, all expected. And at the end, almost as a casual addition, Graciela said, "One more thing. The forest to the north of the camp. The children are not to enter there under any circumstances at any time, and the monitors are not to enter after dark." One of the other monitors, a guy named Felix, who had been at the camp for 2 summers, nodded as if he already knew. The rest of us exchanged brief glances. "Why?" I asked. Graciela looked at me with an expression that was not annoyance but something more akin to the assessment of someone measuring whether the question came from genuine curiosity or from a tendency to question the rules on principle. Because the terrain is uneven and not marked, she said, because there are uncovered water wells in some areas, and because at night it's easy to get disoriented and the village is far away. These were perfectly sensible reasons. I accepted them. But Felix, later that same afternoon, when we were alone preparing the cabins, told me something different. The reasons Graciela gave are true, he said to me, but they are not all the reasons. Felix was 26 years old and was from a town similar to Fuente Oscura, from that mountainous area, which meant he had grown up with a certain type of knowledge about the forests that city people do not have. Not theoretical knowledge, but the practical and intuitive knowledge of someone who has lived close to them since childhood and has learned to treat them with respect without needing anyone to explain exactly why. He told me, while we spread sheets over bunk beds, that the forest to the north of the camp had a reputation in the village, long before any of the current inhabitants could remember. Not a specific fame, with concrete stories and dates and names, rather a diffuse fame, the kind that accumulates in places over generations until no one knows where it started, but everyone knows it exists. The people of the village didn't use that forest. There was another forest to the south where they did walk, where they picked mushrooms in the fall, where the children played. The one to the north they left alone. Why specifically? I asked him. Felix shrugged. There are stories, he said, of people who entered at night and didn't come back or came back different. The kind of stories that have been told in villages forever and that no one knows if they are true or have been exaggerated over time. He looked at me. But those who live here don't go in, and they haven't for generations. And when someone has been respecting something for generations without questioning it, I prefer to respect that too. It was a logic that I understood, although at that moment, the skeptical part of me registered it as local superstition and filed it in the category of interesting but not necessarily significant things. That category gradually emptied throughout the summer. The first groups of children arrived, and the camp fell into that intense and noisy rhythm that is its natural state. Activities, meals, controlled excursions, the small daily crises of coexistence among children of different ages. There was no time to think too much about the northern forest, which remained there, at the back of the campgrounds, with its line of dark trees that from the clearing looked like a green wall, with no apparent depth. But there was something in that forest that I noticed every time I looked at it directly. It was hard to articulate. It wasn't exactly that it looked different from normal forests. It was more a matter of silence. The other forests in the area, the southern one where we had authorized excursions, had sounds. Birds, wind among the leaves, the small noises of animal life. The northern forest from the outside, from the camp clearing, always seemed to be silent. Not the silence of a quiet place, the silence of a place where things stay still when someone looks. I mentioned it to Felix one afternoon. He nodded without surprise. Yes, he said. I noticed it too the first summer. I no longer notice it because I've gotten used to it, but it is still there. The incident that changed everything happened in mid-July, with the second shift of children already settled in. That night I was on duty. Duty meant staying awake until 1 in the morning, making a round through the cabins to ensure that all the children were in their beds and nothing required attention, and then sleeping in the counselor's cabin with the phone next to the bed in case something happened. I made the 11 o'clock round without incident. I made the 12 o'clock round also without incident. It was a quiet night, with a nearly full moon illuminating the clearing with that silvery clarity that makes nighttime places look simultaneously more and less real than during the day. I went to do the 1 o'clock round, and in cabin 7 a girl was missing. The girl's name was Sophia. She was 9 years old, and she was one of those girls who during the day were pure energy and who at night slept so deeply that her cabin mates complained that she snored. She was not the type of girl who would get up alone at night. But her bed was empty and the cabin door was ajar. I checked the bathrooms first. Empty. I checked the activity area. Nothing. I woke Felix, who was the other monitor on duty that night, and while he checked the dining room and the other facilities, I approached the edge of the esplanade, and I saw Sophia. She was standing at the edge of the camp, exactly where the illuminated ground ended and the darkness of the northern forest began. She was in a nightgown, barefoot, with her arms at her sides, looking towards the trees with a stillness that was not the stillness of a girl asleep on her feet. It was the stillness of someone who is completely attentive to something. "Sophia," I said, walking towards her quietly so as not to scare her. She did not respond. She did not move. I got closer. I reached her, put a hand on her shoulder, and she turned to me with an expression that at that moment I did not know how to classify, and that only later, thinking about it, I understood was the expression of someone who has just been interrupted in the middle of something. "What are you doing here?" I asked her in a low voice. Sophia looked at me. Her eyes were wide awake. "I was listening," she said. "Listening to what?" She pointed towards the forest. "The music," she said. "I didn't hear any music. I listened for a long moment with all the attention I could muster, and all there was the silence of the northern forest and the distant sound of the river and the gentle wind among the southern trees." "There's no music, Sophia," I said. She looked at me like children do when adults say something that is obviously incorrect to them, but they don't want to be disrespectful. "There is," she said. "I've been listening to it for a while from the cabin. That's why I came out." I took her back to her cabin. She fell asleep in less than 5 minutes, as if nothing had happened. I sat on the edge of her bed for a while, looking at the closed door, thinking about what she had said. When I left, Felix was waiting for me outside. I told him what Sophia had said, the music that I hadn't heard, the way she had been standing at the edge of the forest. Felix didn't speak for a moment. "Was she looking in or out?" he asked. "In," I said. "Towards the trees." Felix nodded slowly. "I'll tell Graziella something tomorrow," he said. "And let's not let the kids go near the northern edge of the property, not even during the day." The next day, Graziella listened to what we told her with the same calm, evaluative expression she had for everything. When we finished speaking, she paused for a moment in silence and then said, "Sophia was sleepwalking. It's not unusual in children her age, especially in new environments. We will note it and inform her parents so they are aware." It was a reasonable medical explanation. But then, as Felix and I were leaving, Graziella said something else. "Isabel," I turned to her. "The rules about the forest also apply to monitors outside of hours, especially at night. I understand that you were doing your job when you approached the boundary to look for the girl. But in the future, if something like this happens again, wake up another monitor before approaching alone." I looked at her. "Why?" I asked. Graciela held my gaze. "Because 2 people are harder to confuse than 1, she said. And she didn't explain what she meant by that. That night, after the children fell asleep and the camp fell silent, I went out to the clearing with a cup of tea and sat on one of the wooden benches that faced the northern forest. I had no intention of going in. I am neither foolish nor reckless. I just wanted to sit and watch and see if I heard anything that Sophia might have called music. I was there for about 20 minutes. The forest remained in its characteristic silence, that silence that had its own texture, different from the silence of the other forests I knew. The moon was high and clear, and the line of trees was sharply defined, each trunk distinguishable, each branch. It was then that I saw them, not inside the forest, at the edge, among the first trees, just where the moonlight still reached before the darkness of the interior absorbed everything. They were small. I couldn't give an exact height, but the impression I had was of something low, about the height of a 4 or 5-year-old child, although the shape was not that of a child. It was more compact, more horizontal in a way. Even though it was standing, there were several. I couldn't tell exactly how many because they moved slowly between the first trunks, from side to side, and the light was not enough to count them with certainty. 3, maybe 4. They made no noise. I remained absolutely still on the bench, with the cup of tea in my hands, not taking my eyes off that line of trees. And while I was watching them, one of them stopped and turned towards where I was. I can't describe a face because I didn't see a face. What I saw was a direction, the unmistakable feeling that something that had been moving without paying me any attention suddenly was giving me its full attention, and with that attention came something more. Not a sound, not exactly, but something that I perceived as if it were a sound, even though it didn't pass through my ears. A cadence, a rhythm, something that if I had to name it with the closest word I have, I would have called it music, even though it resembled no music I had ever heard before or since. It lasted a few seconds. Then it turned again, and I saw them move away into the forest until darkness absorbed them. I got up. I entered the dining room. I sat under the fluorescent light and stayed there until dawn. I didn't tell anyone what I had seen that night. Not Felix, not Graciela, not the other monitors. There was something about the experience that I didn't want to turn into conversation yet, as if talking about it would change something in the way I had kept it. But I observed more. In the following nights, From the window of my cabin facing north, I looked at the edge of the forest. And 2 more times, on clear moonlit nights, I saw movement among the first trees. Always late, always near the edge, never coming out into the clearing but also not completely inside. I never heard the music again. Or maybe I did hear it but learned not to pay attention to it in the same way. To treat it as Felix had described he did with silence. To get used to it without forgetting that it was there. On the last night of the last shift, when the children had left and we were finishing cleaning the facilities to close the camp until the following year, Felix and I sat on the esplanade with a bottle of cheap wine and talked about what we had experienced that summer. I told him what I had seen that night, for the first time. He listened to the end without interrupting. "What do you think they were?" I asked him when I finished. Felix took his time. "In the villages of this area," he said, "old people have different names for what lives in the forests, different explanations about where they come from and what they want." He took a sip. "But what all the names and all the explanations have in common is this. They are not from here, in the sense that they are not from the side of the world where we are. They are on the edge. And what they do on that edge, we do not do. They do it." "And the music?" I said. "The music is the way they call," he said. "Not to everyone. To some. To those who can hear it." I thought of Sophia, barefoot in her nightshirt, standing at the edge of the trees. "And what if someone enters?" I asked. "Into the forest, at night, following the music?" Felix looked at me. "I don't know for sure," he said. "But the stories told in the villages about people who entered and did not return or returned different." He fell silent for a moment. "Those who returned different took time to recognize their own family. They looked at familiar places as if they were new, as if they had been in another place for a long time, even though physically they had only spent hours. The silence that followed was long and filled with things neither of them said. I returned to the city in September. I resumed my studies, my life, my routines. The camp was left behind in the way that summer jobs are left behind, with that effect of distance that time produces on intense experiences. But Felix was right about something he told me that last night, when we were already picking up the bottle and getting ready to sleep. "What you saw," he said, "does not disappear completely. Not for those who can see it. It's like learning to distinguish a sound that was always there but that you didn't know how to listen to before. Once you hear it, you can't unhear it." He was right. Almost 8 years have passed. I live in a big city, work in an office and lead a perfectly normal life in every verifiable sense. But there are nights, especially in summer, when the moon is high and there is enough silence, when I wake up with that smell in my nose. The smell of the northern forest, that specific mix of damp earth and resin and something older that has no precise name. And sometimes, on the edge between being asleep and being awake, I think I hear something that if I had to name it with the closest word I have, I would call music. In those moments, I get up. I turn on the light. I sit in the kitchen until dawn comes through the window. I have never returned to Fuente Oscura. But sometimes I think of Sophia, that 9-year-old girl barefoot in the dark, completely still, listening. And I wonder if she remembers that night. And if she also experiences the same thing as me in certain summers. I hope not. I hope that for her it has remained just an episode of sleepwalking, nothing more. But sometimes I don't believe that. That's all I have to share, and that's where Isabel's story ends. She wrote to me that she has never sought information about Fuente Oscura or the forests in that area, that she has consciously decided not to do so. I understand that decision. There are answers that change nothing in practice, and only add weight to something that is already heavy enough. What stayed with me the most from this story is that image of the girl at the edge of the forest, listening to something that others could not hear. If you grew up in a town with a place like that, a forest, a hill, a path that no one used without anyone fully explaining why, I would love for you to share it with me in the comments. Those collective stories are what build this space. Take care tonight. We'll hear from each other next time. A listener who signs as Andres sent me this message a few days ago. He told me he had never shared this with anyone outside his family. What he experienced happened when he was 32 years old, in the house where he grew up, taking care of his sick father. If you have something similar kept inside, you know the comments are open. This is what Andres wrote to me. There are things that one doesn't share because they know no one will believe them. Not because the story is extraordinary, but because it lives exactly on the edge between what can be proven and what cannot. I repeated it to myself for a long time. It was stress. It was exhaustion. It was the mind of someone who hasn't slept well for weeks. I told myself this until there was one thing I couldn't explain with any of those reasons. And that's what made me write to this channel. My father's name was Rogelio. A carpenter by trade, a man of few words, with large rough hands that permanently smelled of wood and varnish. When I was a child, I felt invincible. When I saw him for the first time in a hospital bed, connected to tubes, with that pallor that people have when their bodies begin to give in, something in me broke in a way that never fully healed. The diagnosis was heart failure with complications. The doctors were honest. My father was going to need permanent care. I am the oldest son. I have a brother, Marcos, who lives in another city. We agreed that I would take care of things for the first few months while he sorted out his affairs to come and support me. I left my apartment and moved into my parents' house. My mother had died when I was 15, so it was a house that had been solely my father's for almost 20 years. Large for one person, with that silent accumulation of objects that older people's houses have. Furniture that hasn't been moved in decades. Boxes that haven't been opened. Photographs on the walls of a life that I only knew halfway. In the first few days, I was busy organizing everything. Medications, schedules, doctor's visits, calls to the hospital. Activity is an efficient way to avoid thinking. I would throw myself on the bed every night completely exhausted. It was in the second week when I started to notice the door. The house had a long hallway that connected the living room with the rooms at the back. At the end of that hallway, to the right, there was a dark wooden door, smaller than the others, with a metal handle that over the years had acquired that dull color of uncleaned metal. The first time I noticed it was because it was slightly open. I didn't think much of it. Old houses have doors that don't close well. I closed it without thinking and continued with what I was doing. But the next morning it was slightly open again, and the next one, I started to pay attention to it. Behind it was a small, almost empty room, a wooden chair in the center, facing the back wall as if someone had placed it there to sit and look at the wall. And on that wall, at mid-height, there was a dark stain. It wasn't a crack. It wasn't dampness. It was an old stain, with irregular edges, a color between brown and black that absorbed the little light that came in through the only dirty window. I asked my father what that room was. Something in his expression changed in a very small way, but I noticed it because I have known him my whole life. "Storage room," he said. "There's nothing in there." "There's a chair," I said. He didn't respond immediately. "Leave it," he finally said. "Don't use that room." "Why?" "Because I'm asking you," he said, and he turned his gaze to the television. That night before going to bed, I went back to the hallway. The door was ajar. I stood in front of it in the darkness, with only the light from my father's room filtering under his door at the end. The crack was completely black. There was nothing to see, and yet I stayed longer than made sense, with a feeling in my chest that wasn't exactly fear, but something more like the discomfort of looking at something that should be closed. I closed it and went to sleep. That night I dreamed of my mother. It wasn't a pleasant dream. It was one of those dreams with an oppressive atmosphere that the brain constructs when something worries it. My mother was in the hallway in front of the door of the small room, looking at me with an expression I had never seen in her lifetime. It wasn't fear, it was a warning. She said nothing. She just looked at me. I woke up with that weight on my chest that certain dreams leave behind. I heard my father's steady breathing through the wall and convinced myself that it was just that, a dream. The mind of someone exhausted, processing stress. I convinced myself, more or less. The following days were pure routine. Medications, doctor visits, calls from Marcos promising to arrive soon. It was on a quiet afternoon when I heard the sound for the first time. I was in the living room with the laptop open. My father was sleeping. The silence was complete. And then came a soft creak from the hallway, like a wooden chair shifting slightly under the weight of a body settling in. I froze. It didn't repeat. Silence returned. Then about 30 seconds later, another creak. Exactly the same. I got up and walked to the hallway. The door was ajar. From where I was, I could make out the chair in the center of the room. And the chair was moving. Not much. That minimal and rhythmic rocking that a chair makes when someone who was sitting just got up. I slammed the door open. The room was empty. The chair, still. The stain on the wall, just as always. I stood in the doorway looking inside without entering. I didn't enter. I don't know exactly why. Something in me didn't want to cross that threshold. I closed the door and went to check on my father. He was sleeping peacefully, regular breathing. That night, while we were having dinner, I tried to approach the topic in another way. "Dad, how long has that chair been in the back room?" He placed the fork on the plate with a care that was too deliberate. "Andres, I asked you not to go into that room." "I didn't enter. I just opened the door." He nodded slightly, as if that were a relative relief. "It belonged to my father," he finally said. "Your grandfather Ernesto." "My grandfather Ernesto had died before I was born. I only knew him from the few photos in the house, and the even scarcer stories my father told about him, always brief. Always with that neutrality we use when talking about someone with whom the relationship was complicated. "And why is he there?" I asked. My father got up from the table. "Because he has always been there," he said. "And he has to stay there." And he went to his room. That night I couldn't sleep. I stayed listening to the house. And at some point, in that state between sleep and wakefulness, I heard footsteps in the hallway. Slow footsteps. Heavy. The kind of footsteps of someone walking with effort, slightly dragging their feet. I sat up in bed. The footsteps stopped in front of my door. The silence that followed had presence. Wait. Then, very slowly, the footsteps continued and stopped, I deduced, in front of the door of the small room. A creak. The sound of a door opening. And then nothing. I sat in the dark with my hand on the lamp switch but didn't turn it on. Finally, I turned it on and stepped into the hallway. Empty. The small room's door was closed. My father was sleeping peacefully. I went back to my room and didn't sleep until it got light outside. The next day I called Marcos. I told him everything. "Andres," he said, "you've been not sleeping well for weeks. The brain does things when it's exhausted. There's a state between asleep and awake where one can hear things that seem completely real." "And the door?" I said. "I close it tightly, and the next day it's ajar." Silence. "Do you want me to go in first?" "No," I said, not exactly knowing why. "I just wanted to tell someone. That afternoon, while my father was taking a nap, I did something I shouldn't have done. I entered the room. The smell was intense from the inside. Confinement, damp wood, something else I couldn't name. Something old and accumulated, like the smell of places that haven't seen people in a long time. The chair, seen up close, was a piece of beautiful antique carpentry. Dark wood, turned legs, high back. An expensive chair for its time. I approached the stain on the wall. Seen up close, it was different from what I imagined. It had an almost three-dimensional texture, layers that hadn't absorbed the paint in the same way. And it had a shape, not a shape that could be precisely described, but not random either. It was the kind of shape that the human eye automatically recognizes as a silhouette. I reached out to touch her. "Andres." My father's voice from the threshold made me jump, almost knocking me to the ground. He was standing there with his cane, looking at me with an expression that was not exactly fear, but was not anything else either. "Get out of there," he said. I left. He closed the door with a firmness that did not correspond to someone in his condition. We went to the living room. He sat down. I sat down in front of him. There was a long silence. "Did you touch the stain?" he asked with an urgency I had never heard before. "No," I said. "Almost, but no." He exhaled slowly. "Good," he said. "Good." And then he told me, "Your grandfather Ernesto was not a good person." He said it without drama, as if stating a historical fact. "When I was a child, he did things in that room. He had dealings with people who came at night, rituals, things that have names but that I prefer not to say out loud in this house." "Witchcraft," I said. My father neither confirmed nor denied it directly. There are people who seek power in ways they shouldn't, and when they find it, they don't find it alone. There is always something on the other side of the deal, something that gives but also takes, and when the person dies, that something doesn't always leave. "Did it stay in the room?" "It stayed in the chair," he said. "That's why I never moved it. Someone who knew about these things told me that as long as the chair was in that place, whatever was linked to it couldn't move. That if she took it out, or if someone touched the chair or the stain without knowing what they were doing, the bond would break. And what would happen if it broke? My father looked directly at me. "What is in that chair has been waiting for decades to have freedom," he said. "I don't want to know what it would do with it." I processed that in silence. "The steps I hear at night," I said. "The door. I know. Since you arrived, it moves more. Maybe because there are more people in the house. Maybe because it sensed someone was going to enter." "Why didn't you tell me before?" "Because I thought that if I didn't say anything, you wouldn't go." "Did Mom know?" Something crossed my father's face that lasted only a moment. "Your mother knew," he said. "She was the one who taught me how to keep it still. She had knowledge that I don't have." I thought about the dream. My mother in the hallway, in front of the door, looking at me with that warning expression. "Is there any way to end it definitively?" I asked. My father looked at me with that expression he had when he knew something he preferred not to say. "The person who knew how to do it was your mother," he said. The weight of that phrase slowly fell upon me. "And didn't she teach you?" "She taught me what was necessary to keep it, and she told me that when the time came, I would know whom to ask to finish the job. That person was going to appear." There was a silence. "You appeared," he said. "I don't know anything about these things." "I know," he said, "but you have something. Your mother saw it. That's why I'm telling you." What followed was a strange week. My father was giving me instructions that he had kept for years. Things that my mother had written down in a notebook that he took out from under the mattress with the care one has for something very fragile. The notebook was my mother's, her handwriting, her words. Reading it was like hearing her voice after a long time. The instructions were specific. Certain plants that had to be burned in the room in a specific order. Words that had to be whispered, directed towards the stain on the wall. And finally, the chair. To take it out of the room following an exact path that my mother had traced with lines on a handmade map of the interior of the house. A part of me remained the rational man who explained the concept of hypnagogia to his brother. That part observed what I was doing with distant incredulity. But another part, the one that had heard the footsteps and seen the chair sway and dreamed of my mother in the hallway, followed each instruction with absolute seriousness. I did it one Tuesday night. My father in his room with instructions not to come out no matter what he heard. I entered the small room with the plants lit and the dense white smoke that smelled like something I did not recognize. I stood in front of the stain and said the words softly, with a calmness I didn't entirely feel but maintained because the instructions said that fear was counterproductive. Something changed in the room, not dramatically. There was no spectacular manifestation. What changed was the weight of the air. That density I had felt since I arrived at the house, that thickness that made certain parts of the hallway feel slower, was gone. Little by little, like when one opens a window in a closed room and the airs start to balance out. The stain remained on the wall, but something about it was different. It was just a stain. I took the chair out of the room following the path of my mother's map. To the back door, to the yard, to the back, where my father had wood for the fireplace. I burned it. The fire took longer than usual to catch, as if the wood resisted, but it caught. I watched the flames until there was nothing left. That night I slept like I hadn't slept since I was a child, without dreams, without noises, without that feeling of being watched. My father lived almost 2 more years. They were 2 different years, more peaceful in a way that went beyond the medical. He died in his bed, at peace, with Marcos and me by his side. We sold the house. We left the room empty with the door closed. We didn't tell the buyers anything because there was nothing to say. The chair was no longer there. But sometimes, on nights like that, I think about that house and wonder if I did everything right, if I didn't skip any step without realizing it, if what was in that chair really left with the fire, or if it simply found another way to stay. I have no answer for that. I only know that since that night, the footsteps have not returned. Until now. That was all Andres wanted to share. He wrote to me that he hopes putting it into words serves some purpose. I believe it does. If you ever felt something in a house that you couldn't explain, tell me in the comments. I'm interested in reading it. And if this story accompanied you tonight, subscribe. There are many more testimonies waiting. Take care. We'll hear from each other next time.